You have called to us the life of faith. You have called to us the life of faith.
Well, Lord, our gracious God, as we think about the founders of this congregation coming to a new land with a new culture, new language, and the process of adjusting to all of that while trying to establish themselves through poverty and struggle, through depression and wars, it is astounding at their steadfast faithfulness to you and their commitment to the ministry of your church. As we continue to look back at this story today, we pray that you would strengthen us by their example, that you would build us up through their faithfulness, that we too might be faithful in the face of whatever challenges or obstacles face us, knowing that you are with us always, and that as our Lord, you never change, but are the same yesterday, today, and forever. So Lord, bless this time and use it according to your gracious will, for the sake of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. All right, well, in the last session, we looked at the founding and the earliest years of what is now called Faith Lutheran Church. The first record of Danes coming to Hutchinson was 1867, but the group that started this congregation came 3 years later, in 1870. And there's very little record of any of this anywhere. So we don't really know why that first group that came in 67, as far as we know, didn't attempt to found a church. But those who did in 1870 made it a really top priority. Started with 6 families, although I've never seen a total head count, how many that added up to. But it grew steadily through the years, even though it was really tough sledding a lot of that time. I mean, there was no resident pastor here for the first 17 years. They were served by pastors who would come through when they could, or on a very part-time basis. Finances were a constant concern. You remember that the first pastor who did live here, though not full-time, P. Nielsen, was paid semi-annually and had to provide his own housing. So, I mean, they weren't what you'd call generous, but they just didn't have the resources. The first building they finally built was shared with 2 other groups, so they only worshiped every 3rd week as they could. And Faith Lutheran had no full-time pastor entirely of its own until 1928, after its golden anniversary, 58 years into the life of the church. And as you remember, we talked about last week that during this time, what was better known as Main Street Lutheran was a Danish church that was meant to serve Danish immigrants. It was a very parochial view, not just here. Most immigrant churches looked at their ministry that way. They were there to serve their fellow countrymen who had come here. But by 1928, the history of the church notes that it was ready now to accept people of all nationalities, which for us seems like sort of, well, of course, why wouldn't they? But that was actually a major step in Americanization, to see themselves as Danish Americans rather than Danes in America. It was actually a really big step in terms of their self-understanding. Well, before we move on, I just want to share this note that I found this week. I keep finding new resources that I should have had, 3 or 4 weeks ago. But the resources are so scarce that, if something pops up, it's sort of like lightning striking. But I happened to find an article from the Minnesota History magazine, which is published by the Minnesota Historical Society, from December of 1927. On Danish settlers in Minnesota. Written by a guy named Thomas Christensen. He's a Dane, you can tell by the spelling of his name. From Iowa City, Iowa. So probably some kind of history professor at the University of Iowa. Just a brief mention of Hutchinson in terms of how he discusses Danish settlement in Minnesota. But I love this characterization in light of how we've been trying to talk about all this. He says, religiously, most of the Danes who had been Lutherans of either one of two types, if they had been active Christians at home. Too many were not. These types were the intermission people, that's our people, not unlike the German pietists, and the Grundtvigians, a nationalistic kind of Lutheran, to whom an idealized Denmark seemed but little less delectable than heaven itself. Isn't that fabulous? I think it's true, too. I mean, this was Grundtvig, heaven in Denmark, man, it was a fuzzy line between the two. They were just, it was like heaven on earth. So, and it was all tied up in church life and their understanding of the faith in a way that is pretty foreign to us. So, an idealized Denmark seemed but little less delectable than heaven itself. All right, well, last time we kind of cut off the story in 1928 because it's a bit of a dividing line between an immigrant church and an American church with an immigrant background or an ethnic background. Now, any date like that is artificial. You know, it's not like a sea change. Change happened incrementally over time. Just reminds me of a story when I was in college. We had, Dana had this marvelous humanities program that everybody took. You were required. And one piece of it was art history. And Jim Olson was this great teacher, funny as all get out, but he starts out the very first lecture very seriously, as if he's talking about a historical situation. Some Italian guy. And he gives a name and a date, and he said, and on this date, he woke up one morning and said to his wife, the Renaissance started. Only then did we all figure out he was just, this was all hot air. But his whole point was, you can't say the Renaissance started on this day. It's this gradual, incremental change, and then suddenly you recognize that a new era has started. That's what's happening in the church too, of course. Incremental changes, but then suddenly you say, wow, this is really different. This is like a whole new context. So we're using 1928 as that cutoff time. J.T.H. Lund had been the pastor for 12 years, really the first to stay anywhere near that long as a pastor. And you notice in this picture, he's still shown wearing the old Danish clerical garb. The ruff, R-U-F-F, was the collar that they wore. I know that it was sometimes less respectfully called the soup plate around their neck. I really don't know the origin of that, how that came to be the sign of a pastor and you wore that gown. But he's still pictured wearing the old Danish ruff. Even after 1928, the Danish Ladies' Aid, that's one of the last pictures of them. They look like a really cheery group there. But they served their first Abelskiver supper here in 1934. I would have expected their last one to be served in 1934. It was their first one. So, it's not like somehow the Danish heritage just went away in 1928. This continued on in various ways. This Danish Ladies' Aid lasted from 1887 to 1946. And at the same time, there was an English Ladies' Aid. So they were still speaking dansk right up till 1946. I don't know how big a group it was by then. But so again, some of the heritage lingered. But you do start to see a change. This is H.A. Svensson, who followed Lund. And you notice he's just wearing a business suit. Now, it's possible he still wore the ruff on Sunday morning, but he's not identified by it in the same way. Again, I have not been able to pin down when the vestments that the pastors wore changed here. I can tell you that by 1956, when the education unit was dedicated, you see the pastor here wearing the cassock and surplice and stole. That was the clerical garb that I remember growing up, that my dad wore. Interestingly, among some of my colleagues today, it's coming back. They've moved back away from the alb to cassock and surplice. We have not made that move. I'm not sure why they're making that move. There was also, and especially among some of the pietists, a real pushback against any vestments because it was seen as being too Catholic and that the pastors were sort of putting on airs and whatnot. My dad's first call was to 3 tiny little country churches outside of Velva, North Dakota. In fact, from the steps of one, you could see one of the others. But one of them tended to be a very, very pietistic congregation. And of course, he was just green as a spring branch. I think he was only 25 when he got out of seminary. So he goes there the first Sunday, and he's wearing his cassock and surplice. That's what you're supposed to do, right? He comes out to stand before the altar, to reverence the cross before the service begins, and hears behind him someone say audibly, "Never seen anything like that in this church before." It was like, whoops, I guess I should ask some more questions. From then on, it was cassock only in that congregation because it just wasn't done there. At any rate, Paul Nyholm in his book suggests that this switch from the rough to the more typical American surplice and cassock was pretty much complete by 1950. May have been a little earlier than that, actually, but by that time, the change had mostly been made. But a more significant and really important change was the move from Danish to English in the church. This was the biggest piece of Americanization that occurred. The first English service was held in 1923. So again, we're talking past their golden anniversary. First 53 years, every worship service was in Danish. No English spoken here. And yet, almost all English by 1928, and the very last Danish service held in 1935. So they kind of held out on the Danish, and then once there was a crack in the dam, it took very little time for that total change to English. And then all the rest flowed with it. In 1928, the church constitution was translated into English. And probably the Danish version was never read again. 2 years later, English was adopted as the official language of the congregation. So going from, okay, we'll have an occasional English service to please those who don't like their Danish, to, okay, we'll keep an occasional Danish service to please those who don't like English. I mean, again, it's just a 180-degree change here in the church. It was also 1928 when Main Street Lutheran decided it wanted its own full-time pastor. So after Lund left and before Svensson started, they said, we're done sharing a pastor. We need one who is here full-time. And apparently, it doesn't ever, I haven't found it say so in black and white, but apparently that spelled the end for St. Martin's. Because they didn't need and couldn't afford a pastor of their own. And once Main Street didn't want to share a pastor anymore, they hung on for a couple of years. In fact, one of the sources says they sort of desperately tried to keep services, but it just didn't work. So by 1931, they were closed. And Americanization and modernization brought a bunch of other changes with it as well. Offering envelopes were introduced in 1930. Something that we take for granted, although now, with all the electronic giving, people are moving past them, but weren't introduced until then. The first stained glass windows, we were talking about those today, installed right in the heart of World War II. And you think about the sacrifice. One of those first windows is actually dedicated to members of faith serving in World War II because of that. The last one went up in 1945, so it was a process of purchasing and preparing and installing all of those. In 1944, bulletins were used for the first time. Before that, there probably weren't even announcements. Paul Nyholm notes that one of the really American things that finally crept into the church was a pastor making announcements. It just didn't happen before. You did the liturgy, and then you left. That was it. So, and the first kids went to Bible camp. This was to Green Lake, which was founded in 1938. So it took a few years before, that was not a Danish camp, I don't believe. It was a different church body. So it took a while for our kids to be drawn there and to take part in it. And then only in 1945 was a hearing aid system installed. But that was only for people who were really hard of hearing. Maybe something attached to the pew that you could hang over your ear to have it amplified. An actual sound system in the church wasn't installed until 1968, if you can imagine that. Now, without a microphone, we feel like we can't be heard from 5 feet away. It took a gift to project and to speak in a way that people could hear without amplification. Well, as you can see, many of these changes are things that we just now take for granted. Even like, envelopes, starting to question, do we still need that kind of thing? But I think it's interesting to try to imagine church life today without them. I mean, can you imagine not having a sound system in the church? Or not printing any bulletins? Or, some of these things that we now just absolutely take for granted. And so it's also, I think, a helpful reminder that the church is not as stagnant as we sometimes think it is, or suggest that it is. You've maybe heard the 7 last words of the church. We never did it that way before. Or my favorite joke of the genre, how many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? Change? What do you mean change? My grandparents gave that light bulb to the church. So there's this sense that the church is just stuck in the mud and does not change, and tradition is everything. But in fact, tradition is always wrestling with change. And I think you only get into trouble if you overemphasize one or the other. Sometimes there's a sense if you just chase the change, and anything with the aroma of tradition about it has to go, because that's old-fashioned. I think that's really disastrous. On the other hand, if you are so hidebound that you can't entertain a new idea, you're going to lose relevance in a hurry. You're just not going to connect with people in the same way. So this is an ongoing challenge of the church for tradition, wrestling with change, and how you handle that in the best way. Well, by 1935, the church's membership had grown to 471 people. And the need for a bigger church building had become evident. The 1895 church just wasn't doing the job anymore. It wasn't adequate. And I know there was talk about trying to expand it, maybe build a lean-to. It would have been fancier than that, but just a kind of alcove off one side of it to expand the sanctuary. There were different plans that were talked about. But eventually it seemed better to build a whole new church building. But the church didn't look for new property. Back in 1895, they moved from 2nd and Franklin to 4th and Main. Apparently they really liked it here, because there was no discussion of finding a new spot. Instead, they just moved their church services to what is called the Danish Hall. Now, even in our church history, it's put in quotation marks like that, which suggests to me that the authors, that book is 25 years old now, that whoever wrote that then didn't really know what this was. Otherwise, I don't think they'd have put the quotation marks around it. I looked, as extensively as I could to find any mention of the Danish Hall in Hutchinson and couldn't find anything. Any of you have any idea what that might have been or referred to? I'm guessing it was some kind of cultural gathering center for Danes who still wanted to keep their heritage. It might have been connected somehow to what was now Maplewood up on the hill, although that was a totally different denomination, even sort of on the edge of Christian. So I just don't know if what they had, but that's what it says, that they moved to the Danish Hall so that they could raise the 1895 building and build our current sanctuary on the same spot at 4th and Main. So the new sanctuary, what is our current sanctuary, was started on September 9th, 1938. And if you had to guess, what do you think the total cost to build the sanctuary, not counting the windows, because they came in later. I mean, the stained glass windows, they had some kind of window, but, and nothing added onto it, just that building and what was beneath it. What would you guess it cost them? $25,500. And 12 cents. They had a bean counter keeping track. So it's right down to the penny what it costs. Now, of course, you have to figure in inflation. I just used the government's inflation calculator for currency. And according to that, the price today would be about $475,000. But that still strikes me as pretty cheap. I don't think we could rebuild our sanctuary and the hall underneath it for $500,000 today. Now, there was, not much infrastructure to it. Wiring, plumbing was very minimal. No sound system, other kinds of things that would go into a building today. But there is reason to think that a lot of the labor was donated, even though much of it was contracted out as well. So it cost about $475,000 to build it. So not chump change. And especially not in 1938-39. The Great Depression is diminishing by then, but they aren't back, to a really healthy economy yet at that time. So they laid a new cornerstone on October 16th, 1938. And if you go out on the sidewalk on Main Street, you'll see that it's still there, and they saved the cornerstone from the 1895 church, and they're both still sitting there. And there's a record of what went into this cornerstone. Got a lot of ink in the local papers. And the papers at that time, they were looking to fill all the news holes. So they would report in detail things you'd never find in the paper today. But so this was the list of what is in there. The new cornerstone will contain a New Testament, which has been used for a number of years by Reverend Svensson. He had been here for 9-10 years by this point. 2 synodical papers, the Ansgar Lutheran and Luthersk Ugeblad. So one in English, one in Danish, even in 1938. The Ansgar Lutheran was the English language magazine for the UELC for many years. The latter of these, Luthersk Ugeblad, contains a brief write-up of the present building project and also a historical sketch written by Pastor Hans Hansen in 1895. Contains 2 local papers, the Hutchinson Leader and the Hutchinson Banner, each containing a historical sketch of the congregation, a constitution, and a name list of the officers of the various church organizations. So it would be fascinating to open that up and see what kind of condition all those documents are in. Depends on how well they built the box. If it was truly waterproof, those are probably still legible, and you can make something. If any moisture seeped in there, of course, it's just going to be mush when we ever, if ever, finally open that up. So the new church was dedicated, actually, on May 26, 1939. So because of the cornerstone and when it was laid, whenever people ask, when was your sanctuary built? 1938. Well, it was started then, but it actually wasn't finished until the next year. But I also find this interesting because, in old buildings, really old buildings, a cornerstone actually served a function. All the forces came off the cornerstone and it kind of held the building together. So the cornerstone went in first. Today, cornerstones are almost entirely decorative. The one that sits outside our north entrance that says 2010, we put that in after we'd moved into the building and been using it for a month or two. They're just purely decoration. So I'm curious, given that they did this so early on, within the first month, is this one purely decorative? I'm guessing so, but I just wonder that they didn't wait until it was all done. They did it very early on. So whether that has any structural function in the church or not, some architect would have to tell us that. I don't know. All right, well, H.A. Svensson, who came in 1929, took a call to Lutheran, North Dakota in 1942. And his successor then was N.B. Hansen. And I think now at this point, we're getting to pastors that people here would remember. Long-time members would remember pastors like N.B. Hansen. And besides some of those that were named earlier that went past 1942, there were other key events that occurred while N.B. Hansen was pastor here. New chancel furniture was dedicated in 1948. So the kind of blonde wood reredos that we see, and the pulpit and lectern, that was all purchased. That's not original to the building. That was a replacement in 1948. After World War II, Main Street Lutheran, along with some others, helped to sponsor refugees from the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Those had been dominantly Lutheran countries, but they were now under the control of the Soviet Union. And so many refugees fled from there, and as fellow Lutherans, Lutheran churches in America sponsored them. And there were a couple of those refugees from the Baltics who remained members here of Main Street or Faith Lutheran until they died. Now, interesting how the cycle turns. After all those years of communist domination, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are almost entirely atheistic. The church was just crushed in those countries, but not destroyed. And now one of our mission partners today is the Tartu Theological Academy in Estonia that's trying to rebuild the church in that Baltic country. So from a Lutheran heritage to the refugees to the crushing of the church to the reestablishment of it, we are tied to those Baltic countries. And of course, starting in about 1946, you had the baby boom. And so there was need for an education building. More room for Sunday school, more room for other kinds of youth and family activities. Now, N.B. Hansen moved to Poughkeepsie, Wisconsin in 1955. And the new pastor, Ed Hansen, was installed in 1956, July 22nd of 56. Now, I met Ed Hansen, I think, once in my life, maybe twice. But as it happens, when I served in Redwood Falls, our longtime church custodian, who was an enthusiastic storyteller, his mother was a sister with Ed Hansen's wife. And so through the years, our custodian told me all sorts of stories about Uncle Ed. Uncle Ed is this and Uncle Ed that and what he did in the church. So every time I look at that picture of Ed Hansen, I think, Uncle Ed. He's actually not related to me, but I sort of feel like he's my Uncle Ed because of all those stories. The same day that he was installed, they broke ground for the new education unit. So this picture was up before. The guy in the cassock and surplice over here is Ed Hansen. So all the preparatory work was done under N.B. Hansen. Ed Hansen comes in, turns a shovel, and the building of the unit begins. It was dedicated on May 12, 1957. And I just found this picture interesting because it goes back to before the breezeway was built to connect those two. In the late 60s, maybe 1970, that was put on. So you still have this glorious front entrance to the church, and then this is a whole separate building just next door. I still wish, there's a part of me that wishes they had never taken those front steps off the church.
Not if you had to walk them.
Well, that's probably true. That's probably true. I get to just sit and admire them. I didn't have to go up and down them.
They were
But
here when we came.
is that right? Yeah. I just think it's very nice looking with that door right onto Main Street and the steps. It probably was not the most accessible entrance into the church. Now, this educational unit was used until 2009. It was the Old North Fellowship Hall. It had offices in it. It had Sunday school rooms. And then what was underneath the sanctuary then was the South Fellowship Hall during those years. Now, some additional kind of Americanization things, developments that happened when Ed Hansen was pastor. In 1956, that same year, the first newsletter was sent out in the congregation. Anybody remember what it was called?
Messenger?
There you go, the Messenger. We still have people today, when they're referring to Faith Matters, they say the Messenger. Yeah, I was in the Messenger last month. Well, I don't think so, actually, but, that name sticks. So for many years, it was the Messenger. I honestly don't know when it changed to Faith Matters. I'm guessing when Randy Freund was here, because that's the kind of name he would like. But on Palm Sunday in 1957, they had acolytes for the first time. That seems like a really old-fashioned thing, but they came into use here at a very late date. I'm sure before that, the ushers just lit the candles before the service began. In fact, again, going back to those little country churches that my dad served in his first call, one of the things that my mother just remembered with horror for years and years afterward is that they had one faithful old usher who would go clomping up into the chancel every Sunday, reach into his pocket, pull out an old farmer's match, and light it off his jeans, and then get all the candles lit. And it's like, oh, God bless you. But we could use a little more dignity here, actually, than that. So, and then perhaps the most significant change here, in 1958, the name of the congregation was finally changed from Main Street Lutheran to Faith Lutheran Church. Part of that was driven by the awareness that Main Street Lutheran had never been legally filed as a name. And I'm guessing, although I can't prove, maybe if we really dug through the minutes we could find out, but that they discovered in trying to build this education unit that the title wasn't entirely clear because Main Street Lutheran was not a legal name. So for that reason, they changed it, and I imagine Faith was just seen as a better witness, as a name for a church, not as distinctive. There are a lot of Faith Lutherans out there, not too many Main Street Lutherans, but I imagine seen as a better witness in terms of a name of the church. Well, the Americanization of churches, so that they were less distinctive from one another, drove a sense, a desire for mergers. That all these little denominations would do better if they got bigger. Merge with other church bodies to form larger church bodies. Part of that just reflected the corporate mindset of the 50s and 60s. I mean, this was the corporate era. IBM and all the great corporations that were dominating the business world and the culture at that time. But it also seemed to make sense in terms of efficiency, use of resources, that we're just kind of doubling up because we aren't that different from one another anymore. And so in 1960, the UELC, that was the Danish United Church that Faith belonged to, combined with the Evangelical Lutheran Church, that was the big Norwegian church that is my heritage, where my father and grandfather served, plus the American Lutheran Church, just American Lutheran. Formally, there's no "the" on the front. It's just American Lutheran Church, which was a German denomination. This is where Pastor Paulus was ordained and originally served in American Lutheran Church. Well, together they formed the American Lutheran Church. And many times "the" is emphasized, or it's abbreviated as TALC to distinguish it from the earlier ALC. Now, the Norwegians were by far the dominant member of this new denomination. They were the biggest. Then ALC, I think ALC was second, and UELC brought up the rear in terms of size. But Ed Hansen was elected the first district president of the Southwest Minnesota district of the ALC, sorry. So he left here in 1960 to take on that new position in Wilmer. Left on June 28th, so he was here almost precisely 4 years as a pastor. Now, there was a good case to be made for mergers like this. And at the time, there was a great deal of enthusiasm for them. But in hindsight, I think we're starting to see that, especially for denominations like the UELC, mergers like this hurt as much as they helped. And this isn't just my opinion. For example, Mark Granquist, who is a church historian at Luther Seminary, has made the same case. That these mergers, which were really driven by a corporate mindset, ended up not being all that positive in a lot of ways. For example, because the ELCA was the smallest church body that came into the ALC, its Danish heritage was largely just swallowed up and lost. Unless you had a congregation that really hung on to that and was determined to remember it, it was just gone. Faith was not one of those places. That did not have a strong sense of that Danish heritage. And that's why you find virtually no sign of it around here, except this year when we're really zoning in on it. It brought a new hymnal, a new church magazine, a much larger denomination. So some of these beloved things like the St. Ansgar Lutheran or the hymnal for church and home are just gone, and it's all new. And so your ties to the past are cut in a way. You don't have that same connection. And I think over time it led to less identification with the church body, less loyalty to it, less connection to other members of the church. One of the things you'll notice is before all these mergers, pastors like the ones who served here, they go from here to Wisconsin to New York to California to Canada and back again, because, the whole church felt like you knew them all. By the time I was ordained, which was shortly after the ELCA formed, I hardly knew a soul outside of my own synod, And the sense of a national church was just like, you just didn't know it. You didn't know those people. And so I think the church became much less like an extended family and much more like a corporation. Became more impersonal, more just organizational, rather than this sense of we know who we are and we're in this together kind of thing. So yes, there were positive arguments for these mergers. There was a good reason for them. But over time, we've seen the losses that came with that as well. So we started in 1928. 1960 also marks a very significant end of an era for Faith Lutheran Church. The UELC is no more. And now they're in the much bigger ocean of the ALC. And so there are some real changes and losses there, but of course it didn't stop mission and ministry from continuing here. And so in our last time together next week, we will cover this most recent era from 1960 on.
You have called to us the